Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Divulgence. Today I am welcomed by Habsburg Jawlly West. Hey, Habsburg, how are you, my friend?
Hey, man, I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. Thank you so much for giving me your time. We met chatting online. You have some awesome stuff that you post on Twitter, some awesome research. So I thought we should hook up. And today we're going to be getting into essentially social engineering involving Tavistock, Grateful Dead, the CIA, and LSD, all that fun stuff. So, where do you think we should begin? We'll start with the Tavistock Institute. Maybe you can tell everyone what the Tavistock Institute is exactly. I've read a little bit about it, and it seems to come up a lot in social engineering, mind control topics, stuff like that. And it's also a very, I guess you could say, popular name when it comes to conspiracy related topics. So yeah, um, give us the rundown on the Tavistock Institute, Esberg.
Okay, and I'm getting a little bit of the glitch, but we'll try to keep going. I mean, am I
Oh
coming through okay on your end?
yeah, you're coming through good, man.
All right. I'll just try to make sure that we're keeping it rolling. But anyways, as far as the Tavistock Institute goes, it was spawned out of, it's called the Wellington House. Around the start of World War I in England, and it was set up to be like the British propaganda bureau. Essentially, at the start was to get public support to build consensus amongst the English population to enter into World War I. And so it was, a lot of it was about demonizing Kaiser Wilhelm, and putting out a lot of like visual propaganda, and like early radio propaganda, things like that, about how they were butchering people in Germany, innocents, doing like really horrible, things, and trying to basically build empathy among the English public, to get them engaged in this World War One. World War One obviously was this mass kind of national realignment. Things that are kind of like a little more broad than we probably need to go into, but there was a lot of impetus to get them involved, because this is like the like the Fabian strategy, the Milner, the Rhodes Milner, round table groups. I mean, this is all about like establishing globalism, right? And realigning national boundaries. That's what World War I really did. So basically, like, it was a big thing that was promoted in England and via this Wellington House. So after the war, we're kind of just like fast forward. It was successful. Public sentiment was, off the charts to be involved in World War I, and it was obviously like incredibly devastating. World War I is probably one of the most gruesome, most really just nasty, wars in history, just because of the scale, of the amount of people involved, the casualties, the like different kinds of warfare, because it was like moving from more traditional types of warfare into like having tank, like modern artillery, tanks, airplanes, things like this. So it was kind of like a hybrid of different types of weapons, different types of combat, and it was just really devastating. You hear about like the foxholes, and like this was a kind of a different level of trauma that the soldiers were coming home having experienced. And so the Tavistock Clinic was born out of the Wellington House. So essentially they set up the propaganda to get England involved in World War One. And then when the soldiers were coming back home, they had kind of spawned the Tavistock Clinic out of Wellington House to treat shell shock, is what they called it. So that was like the first incarnation of what we call PTSD now, right? And so they were studying this shell shock, and what that really is in terms of social engineering, like very few things are more valuable to being able to alter consciousness than extreme trauma, right? So they were really trying to get a grasp on how to harness that as a potential for, they framed it as that they're is altruistic. Their aims with the clinic were altruistic in terms of treating people with the PTSD, with the shell shock, but really what they were doing was learning how to manipulate it, how to control people through that interface of the trauma that they experience, how to trigger flashbacks, how to induce like dissociation, things like that, right? It's trauma-based mind programming. This was very early on in developing those kind of techniques, and this was just having the access to just almost infinite amounts of subjects that had come home from the war. So they were rather successful with that, and you had all of this work being done by John Rawlings Rees, who was the head of the clinic, and Eric Triste, who we're gonna, he's gonna be a big part of the story when moving into the other aspects. But in 1947, they had the opportunity to take on funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, and that's when the Tavistock Clinic became the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, which is what it's now known as. And this was like bringing in Kurt Lewin, who was really influential with oh, I just cut out for a second. Are we still good?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. And he did, Kurt Lewin was responsible for like group dynamics, like T groups, encounter therapy, stuff like that. This is kind of like what spawned like sensitivity training. And that was, a big focus for Eric Triste. Kind of like what we think of now as like political correctness, is like kind of what came out of sensitivity training. And that was, like a big aspect of what he was involved in. They ultimately, the like scope of what Tavistock has, been involved in is just like, it's kind of impossible to really like define it, in just in terms of like psychological theories or principles like that. I mean, they really became kind of like a factory for culture creation, and right. A lot of different NGOs and different things were spawned out of Tavistock. Just over the years, it's still going, and it's a really powerful organization that, obviously, I think one of the things that really made the news very, recently in the last few years was that they, had the gender clinic that, that they were performing, gender affirming care, for children, and they ended up having that shut down. So a lot of people conflate like Tavistock Institute with their gender clinic and think that like Tavistock is no longer operational, when, you know, really that was just a kind of infinitesimal aspect of their operation. And that's really interesting too, is to kind of, you know, create that, you know, dialectic around the, you know, the gender clinic stuff, and the children, you know, like gender care, you know, to kind of obfuscate the rest of their operations and be like, oh, look, see, that doesn't exist anymore. We're not doing that. And, you know, they're definitely still, you know, big time involved in, you know, I mean, a lot of the influencers that we see online are groomed by the Tavistock Institute. A lot of, you know, pop culture, pop music, you know, television, you know, movies, all of this stuff, you know, like has had and still does have its roots, you know, in Tavistock. So that's kind of just like a brief overview. I don't know if that kind of hit on a lot of the points.
Absolutely, man. Yeah. So, what are some of the famous products of Tavistock? I know that one band, when you're talking about like the drug culture and CIA and LSD and all that, obviously the one band that always comes up is the Grateful Dead, right? So is there a connection there with the Grateful Dead and the Tavistock Institute?
Well, there's a really big connection, and you know, kind of like backtracking a little bit in terms of like pop music and stuff like that. And this is, you know, not completely substantiated, but I mean, this is the, you know, a lot of the speculation is actually that like the Beatles were a product of Tavistock. I mean, like Tavistock had absorbed Theodore Adorno, who is a philosopher and a musical composer from the Frankfurt School, who emigrated to the UK, like, you know, after, you know, like in the Third Reich, you know, after Hitler took over. And I mean, he was a really, you know, brilliant guy. You know, Frankfurt School, obviously these guys were, you know, communists, and you know, they were not welcome in Germany. Theodore Adorno was absorbed into the Tavistock Institute, and, you know, a lot of the theory, a lot of the speculation is that he was actually the one writing all of the music for the Beatles, and you know, coming up with the compositions, a lot of the lyrics too. And you know, like there's definitely like no bigger influence on, you know, pop culture in the 20th century than the Beatles. So that was, you know, that's kind of the really, really big one.
And sorry, who was the individual that you just mentioned that is possibly credited with writing songs for them?
Theodore Adorno, Adorno. And you know, again, he was like a philosopher from the Frankfurt School, and a composer, really prolific. And you know, this is just kind of like the high speculation that he was the one who was actually writing and composing the music and lyrics, you know, for the Beatles on behalf of the Tavistock Institute, with the express intent of using it to like manipulate culture, to you know, kind of like change youth culture specifically, right? And you know, there are a lot of things that came out of that, like, you know, just the aspect of, say, like long hair. You know, people like not cutting their hair, like really came from the Beatles. And then, you know, it's interesting because you think now, like, you know, how gender identity and all of these things are, you know, so much a part of, you know, the cultural conversation, the culture war dialectic, whatever. But like how much of that comes from, you know, just things like men, you know, having long hair. You know, where did that come from in, you know, the 20th century? It was like popularized by the Beatles. So what happened is, you know, the Beatles, you know, came on, you know, around like 63, 64. But in, you know, the previous couple of years, Eric Triste, the founder of the Tavistock Clinic, was on sabbatical from Tavistock, and he was living in Palo Alto, California, with his son, Alan Triste. And this would have been around like 1961. So Palo Alto obviously is the home of Stanford University and the Stanford Research Institute, which is SRI, which is now like a private institution. It's been like spun off officially from the Stanford University, but at the time it was actually part of the university. It was kind of like this is like where so much of Silicon Valley and all the tech comes out of is Stanford Research Institute. And like I said, it was really an extension of the Tavistock Institute in America. So Eric Triste was over here with his son Alan in Palo Alto, and they were living like in the same neighborhood as Ken Kesey. So you're familiar with Ken Kesey, the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and he was in a graduate writing program at the time at Stanford, and he was writing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is all about like mind control, psychiatric manipulation, right?
Right.
And
sure.
he was working at the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital at the time. Just like in the Palo Alto, area, is, involved with Stanford, but, part of the VA. Again, they're always using, veterans and people, who fought in military conflicts, in a lot of these things, but they were using the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital, the VA, to perform like MK Ultra experiments on drugs at the time. This is like late 50s, early 60s. And so Kesey himself was a volunteer in the program. They were dosing the subject, and this was run like by Sidney Gottlieb, who was like the head of, that aspect of MK Ultra for the CIA. Right. This was like directly under his auspices. And so, Ken Kesey was a volunteer. They were dosing him with mescaline, LSD, a bunch of different, drugs, and just seeing like what the effects were. And it was open to volunteers. So Ken Kesey, Allen Ginsberg, who was, one of the like foremost, cultural literary figures of the Beat generation, right? And Ken Kesey was kind of like this bridge between the Beats and the hippies, and kind of like created, the hippie movement in a way, branching from the Beat generation. But, like another significant individual who was a volunteer in these tests at the Menlo Park Hospital was Robert Hunter, who became Jerry Garcia's songwriting partner for the Grateful Dead. And he is, he's actually like the great grandson of Robert Burns, who is like this, high level Masonic, like poet and songwriter in Scotland. He's like the, like the greatest, like national, songwriter in, Scotland. He wrote, he wrote like Auld Lang Syne, like the, the song that everybody sings.
Really?
At New Year's. Yeah, that was Robert Hunter's great grandfather. And so, and what's really crazy is all of the people in this saga, like their family backgrounds, these are not just like plebes. These are not just like regular people. These are people that have, that come from, like very important people, a lot of like aristocratic stock, but just people that have had a great degree of influence, like and we'll get into this guy later too. But the other lyricists, so Robert Hunter was Jerry Garcia's lyrical collaborator. Jerry would write the music for his songs. Robert Hunter would write the lyrics, and then the other songwriting team in the Grateful Dead was Bob Weir and John Perry Barlow. And John Perry Barlow, wrote the lyrics for Bob Weir's songs. And John Perry Barlow was like the great grandson of Israel Barlow, who was one of the like original Mormons, who was like baptized by Brigham Young, who was like a direct disciple of Joseph Smith. I mean, these are like, high level people. And his family is like, really big in the like political power structure in Wyoming. John Perry Barlow actually like worked for Dick Cheney as a campaign coordinator. I mean, like, these are, this is like the power locus of, the state of Wyoming. And, in the Mormon hierarchy, these are, important people, but this is the kind of like background that these people come from. They're not just like nobodies off the street. But sorry, it's kind of like winding back to, Eric Triste, the founder of the Tavistock Institute, was living in Palo Alto, and his son, Alan Triste, probably was being like deployed into the youth culture scene at the time, to kind of like infiltrate. And he met Jerry Garcia, just kind of like at the, they were playing like folk music and bluegrass music, in like kind of the coffee shops, in Palo Alto. A lot of people, they think of the Grateful Dead as a San Francisco band, but they're really a Palo Alto band. They all, came from Palo Alto, which is where, again, this is the, like the social engineering hub, Palo Alto, Santa Clara, Mountain View, all of Silicon Valley, like, the peninsula, the South Bay, like this is, really where all of the culture, and technology has been manufactured. So, and the degree of like integration between like the Grateful Dead, psychedelics, and the technology, it's like completely intertwined and, kind of like inextricable from one another. So Palo Alto, being that they like established in Palo Alto, is really important. And so the story goes that Alan Triste and Jerry Garcia were just like hanging out, and they heard like music and loud conversation in the backyard. And just so happened that the neighbor and behind them was Ken Kesey. They went over, knocked on the door, invited themselves into, the party that Ken Kesey was hosting. And like, that's how the Grateful Dead, made contact with the Merry Pranksters. The Merry Pranksters being, Ken Kesey's, group of, like artists, bohemians, beatniks, what have you. And so that was how the contact was made. It was like via Eric Triste's son with Jerry Garcia. At the time, Jerry Garcia had just left the army. He was, dishonorably discharged as a conscientious objector or whatever. Hard to say what the real story is. There's a lot of, hypothesis that he was like sheep dipped, and that, he was really like kind of programmed with, kind of like a mission on behalf of military intelligence to like, become like a cultural figure, which is why they, discharged him after less than a year of service. He was serving at Fort Ord in the Monterey Bay, and then the Presidio in San Francisco proper. And Monterey Bay, Fort Ord, it's, high level military intelligence. The base has been decommissioned, but like in the Monterey area, you have like the defense intelligence language school, the naval postgraduate school. I mean, it's high level, and that's where Jerry Garcia was serving at Fort Ord, and then was transferred to the Presidio in San Francisco, which is where Michael Aquino was serving. If you're familiar with Michael Aquino, who founded the Temple of Set, and you're talking like really high level occultism. I mean, he was a colonel in the U.S. Army, in charge of psychological operations. He wrote the paper on mind war, from psyop to mind war, with General Paul Vallely. I mean, he's a really important figure in terms of, psychological operations, mind control, and like straight up Satanism. And he founded the Temple of Set, which was an offshoot of the Church of Satan from Anton LaVey, who was also in San Francisco. All these things were happening in San Francisco. So Jerry Garcia was serving at Presidio, which was also like in the 1980s. Like the location of a giant scandal involving child sexual abuse. I don't know if you've heard about that. The Presidio scandal is a really big deal, and it was surrounding Colonel Aquino. And basically the accusation was that Michael Aquino was basically like trafficking children that were in the daycare facility at the Presidio, like taking them from the daycare facility to like his private home on Russian Hill in San Francisco, and like doing all kinds of like crazy, satanic, ritual abuse, sexual abuse. And the reason that it was discovered was because these children as young as 3 were like testing positive for like chlamydia and sexually transmitted diseases. So, this is substantiated. And of course, like Michael Aquino and his wife, Lilith, they like beat the charges. They dropped the charges, and they got away scot-free. But anyways, that's what was going on at the Presidio, and that's where Jerry Garcia was serving before he got like dishonorably discharged, and into into the kind of circle of the Tavistock, founder and his son, Eric Triste and Alan Triste. So, Alan, over time, he became the manager of the Grateful Dead's publishing company. I mean, he is really, really like important to their organization. He was Jerry Garcia's best friend. I mean, this is the son of the founder of the Tavistock Institute. I mean, it's like not insignificant. He was, involved in managing like the publishing of their music, and so what's interesting is that their publishing company is called Ice Nine Publishing, which is a reference to the Kurt Vonnegut novel Cat's Cradle, if you're familiar. And so Ice Nine, that they named the publishing company after, is like a reference to this like variation of like an ice, like it's like some kind of like isotope or whatever of water, or whatever. I'm not a chemist, so I can't say, but essentially Ice Nine is like something that in this novel by Kurt Vonnegut, who is like a big figure, in the science fiction kind of counterculture, like, definitely like involved with social engineering. He wrote Cat's Cradle, and in Ice Nine is this thing that it's a type of ice that once it touches anything, like any, liquid water, it turns that into itself. Like and it's not temperature dependent. It's like this self-replicating thing, which is kind of what all this culture, is about, right? This like, culture creation, social engineering, is that it's like self-replicating, that once it, touches, makes contact, then the people that it like kind of inducts or initiates then go on to initiate more people, right? Gotcha. It's like it's a pyramid scheme in a way, right? Like, in a way, yeah. One guy gets turned on, from like, at the CIA experiments at the hospital, then they're like, oh, I'm going to go and turn on 10 more people. And those 10 more people turn on 10 more people each. And, next thing you know, you've got like thousands and thousands of people that are turning on in a really short amount of time. Right. So, sorry if that's like all over the place, but that kind of catches us up to like where the Grateful Dead begin, and like the Tavistock origins of the band via the Triste family. And so at that time, Jerry was also already collaborating with Robert Hunter, who as we mentioned before was a volunteer subject in the Menlo Park MK Ultra experiments. So he had already turned on. Jerry gets together with Ken Kesey, Robert Hunter, and then he gets turned on. He's already like making contact just through kind of like the music scene in Palo Alto with Bob Weir, with Phil Lesh, with Tom Constantine, who's a Scientologist. Also, Robert Hunter was a Scientologist for at least 30 years. He claims to have like left in 1999, but that's significant too. All of this is really interwoven. So they're all playing together, and then Ken Kesey and the pranksters, they sort of like start this thing. Everybody's heard of the acid test, right? And this was kind of like how LSD sort of became like proliferated as like a recreational, kind of like, something that was done outside of a clinical setting, right? Like up into that point, when the first acid tests were happening in 1965, it had, really been like, kind of like confined to clinical settings, universities. Ken Kesey and his, kind of group, they had been using it, privately in Palo Alto. And this was, Ken Kesey and Neil Cassidy, who was the basis for Dean Moriarty and Jack Kerouac's On the Road. Like, he's a really important figure in like the beat culture. This was, these were like the Merry Pranksters, Ken Babbs, they were using, LSD that they were getting from, the VA hospital, like where they, via the CIA, getting it from Sandoz, right? This was like that's how they were getting it directly. Ken Kesey was an employee there. He claims that he was stealing it, but he was right. He was probably being given it. It stands to reason that, like, look, they wanted this to like leave the laboratory. They wanted this to, that's what all of these experiments were, to like see what they were dealing with, and then take it to the next level by like unleashing it into the public. And so he was becoming close with all these musicians, and the idea was to kind of like make this confluence of various like cultural expressions, artistic expressions. So, and they were experimenting with sound. They had like again, like where these people had the money to buy all this crazy sound equipment, state of the art back then in the early 60s, like it just didn't exist. This was all stuff that was being developed in Palo Alto, like coming out of the Stanford, kind of milieu. So they had this like, really advanced, sound, equipment, but like lights and color, like light show, stuff. This was like where all of it comes from, right? Like the modern kind of like rock and roll concert. It all comes right from the acid test. And they were doing and they were doing like really crazy stuff. I mean, the combination between like strobing lights and these sounds where they were doing like echoing and, things that were coming out of one speaker here and another speaker here, and, things that would like, cause, a person like some serious like dissonance, between like what they were hearing on this side and what they were hearing on this side at the same time. Bring in like, they were giving people like 400 micrograms of, Sandoz LSD, like just for walking through the door, and then like the Grateful Dead was playing. And, it's just like, it's one of these things where this was like really how the counterculture, like the hippie movement really spawned. There was also, it's probably like worth mentioning some cross-pollination with the East Coast scene, because there was like a psychedelic scene on the East Coast that was, centered around Timothy Leary, who was a Harvard professor who got basically kicked out of Harvard for doing these kinds of experiments on LSD and psilocybin and things like that. And probably he was working already for the CIA. It was probably by design that he was like unceremoniously like thrown out of Harvard to kind of like run cover for the operation that he was involved in. And he basically set up is called the International Foundation for Internal Freedom, IFIF. And they were operating out of an estate in upstate New York that was given to him by a fella named William Mellon Hitchcock. And so the Mellon family, from Pittsburgh, it's like, the Mellon Bank, Gulf Oil. I mean, we're talking like serious robber baron, industrialist money. That was their family. And, like William Mellon Hitchcock, like his uncle was, one of like the high level operators in the OSS. I mean, Hitchcock himself was definitely working for the CIA. He was, he set up Timothy Leary to be, running IFIF out of the Millbrook estate, which was like a 2,500 acre estate. And they were just like, just doing whatever they wanted up there. They, it's interesting. At a certain point, they actually got raided by, I think it was just the county or the state of New York. But it was G. Gordon Liddy from the Watergate scandal was one of the officers who raided the Millbrook estate and Timothy Leary. But
wow.
Yeah. But basically that it was, Ken Kesey and the pranksters, they had this school bus that they painted all like psychedelic day glow colors. And in 1965, they drove it to Millbrook, New York, across the country. And that's like, that's this really, kind of like seminal event that like kind of spawned hippie culture. And they were just taking acid and giving it to everybody all over the country, and, ended up, in New York for like a meeting of the minds with Timothy Leary. Leary never actually like met with them. He kind of like turned them away. And so, they were kind of salty about that. But that's kind of like where, the culture comes from. You had like the pranksters on the West Coast, you had, the Leary scene on the East Coast. And, the even though, it was, kind of like counterculture, the East Coast scene was still a lot more like entrenched in like education and, like clinical psychology. And they were a lot more straight laced at the time. And these guys, in Palo Alto, they were like hippies. And so they started, these, acid tests. And we can only imagine, who was actually observing these things. I mean, we're talking like these were like open air MK Ultra, tests, experiments, it just in like casual, social settings to whatever degree, but they were recording these things. There are like audio recordings, there are like, limited film recordings. I mean, you can like see this, there's, this is like well documented. So, they definitely wanted to see, what people would do, when they were like under the influence of psychedelic drugs flashing, lights with different colors and, at different, like tempos, sound in, coming in different ways, like all novel things that, technologies that hadn't existed before. Right. So, sorry, that's, like I said, there's,
dude,
like,
this is great. This is great. I'm loving this.
Okay. So, all right. So we kind of like established that that's where all of this comes from, right? The pranksters, the CIA, Tavistock, Grateful Dead. We've got like all of that, kind of linked up now. And I guess a big component now is, are you familiar with the name Owsley Stanley?
No.
Okay. So Owsley Stanley, again, this guy is the grandson of Augustus Augustus Owsley Stanley, who was the governor of Kentucky, a U.S. congressman, and a U.S. senator on his father's side. He was his paternal grandfather. His mother's father was also like a U.S. congressman from Kentucky. I mean, these are like elite people, from Kentucky. And, like, again, all of these people like have these, rarefied backgrounds, I just to emphasize that these are just not normal people from normal families. And, so Owsley Stanley, he attended the University of Virginia, dropped out. As a teenager, he had voluntarily checked himself into St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., which is like this major, psychiatric institute in D.C. that was basically like under the, authority of the CIA, still is in operation. And, this is like likely where he got initiated into a lot of different things. He got out, attended the University of Virginia briefly, dropped out, and moved to the West Coast. He enlisted in the Air Force and then ultimately started working for a company called Rocketdyne. And Rocketdyne, sorry, let me just. It was an offshoot of the National. North American Aviation. And, this was a company that ultimately it became part of Boeing. But they were working on like V2 rockets, like they were bringing in a lot of these Operation Paperclip, like Nazi scientists, right?
Okay. Gotcha.
And so much of this, like, has so many ties in with the paperclip stuff. MK Ultra like really is a paperclip operation. It's kind of like an extension of what they were doing, like in Germany in concentration camps. Like that's really where a lot of the psychological testing came from. Was they were using like drugs like mescaline and stuff, and like brain surgery and things like that in the camps in Germany. So Owsley Stanley was working at Rocketdyne. Presumably he, had, contact with, these like Nazi rocket scientists, including like Werner von Braun was there. The really interesting thing was that the facility for Rocketdyne, it was the Santa Susana Field Laboratory, and it was located about 1.1 miles along the Santa Susana Pass from the Spawn Ranch, which is where like the Manson family was operating. So, I mean, all of these things are just so incredibly intertwined and interconnected. Charles Manson, for example, took his first LSD trip at a Grateful Dead concert at the Avalon Ballroom in 1967. I mean, it's just like all of these things are, it's all really wrapped up into one thing. And, of course, like, the Grateful Dead were part of, after they moved from Palo Alto into San Francisco, they were living at 710 Ashbury, like, right at the, confluence of Haight and Ashbury streets. And, this was like the epicenter of, the hippie culture. They, like, we're down the street from the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. That this is where, like, the guy that, my handle is named, Jawlly West, Jawlly and West, who was an MK Ultra, CIA doctor. He was, using he didn't start the Haight Ashbury Free Clinic. A guy named David E. Smith did, but Jawlly West was using the free clinic as a way to, like, observe, what was going on with, youth who were using the drugs that the CIA was deploying on the streets, and, like all these, like, acid casualties. And that's where they would come. They were, specifically, like, treating people who were having bad trips and, venereal disease from orgies and weird stuff like that. And that's, Charles Manson, was bringing his, girls in, like, regularly to the free clinic, the Haight Ashbury Free Clinic, to get treated for venereal disease. Like, this is, again, a confluence of so many different, aspects of what this was, and some of it was really dark, like Manson, Manson, one of his, like, cult members, like the high up in, his organization, who was responsible for the Gary Hinman murder, was Bobby Beausoleil. Bobby Beausoleil lived with the filmmaker Kenneth Anger, who, like, are you familiar with Kenneth Anger?
Of course, for sure.
Yeah, right. So, he was making Lucifer Rising. Bobby Beausoleil did all of the music for Lucifer Rising. They were living at a house on Folsom Street called the Russian Embassy, like a mile away from, like the Grateful Dead's house at 710 Ashbury. Like, there's, absolutely, like, a lot of cross-pollination. It had to have been. Kenneth Anger would rent out a music or a venue called the Straight Theater, STRAIT, and the Grateful Dead would, like, play concerts there too, So, they were, like, there's no way that they weren't, like, making contact with one another. Kenneth Anger, the Grateful Dead, again, cross-pollination. There's a lot of, like, thelemic rituals. This is, this is what was going on. And so, that's kind of like the real, like, undercurrent of what this really is. These, like, acid drenched, like, hippie concerts are really, like, thelemic rituals, like open air, like occult initiations, and, by design. So I got to get back to Owsley Stanley, because he's really, really important to all of this. He was, working as an engineer at Rocketdyne, then for a period of time for Jet Propulsion Laboratory, right, in Pasadena. And you're probably familiar with JPL and its founder, Jack Parsons, right? Who was, right, Jack Parsons was, like, a direct disciple, like the top disciple of Aleister Crowley, and of course was, like, involved with L. Ron Hubbard doing the, like, Babylon working in, the desert in the 50s to, like, create the Moonchild. This is big stuff. Owsley Stanley was working there as an engineer, and after he did that, he just, like, quit the aerospace industry and just, like, showed up in Berkeley, and, like, started auditing classes at the University of California at Berkeley, and just, like, showed up in a chemistry class that Sasha Shulgin, Alexander Shulgin, was teaching. And so Alexander Shulgin is, like, he created more psychedelic compounds than any person in like all of history. He wrote these books called P-Cal and T-Cal. P-Cal is phenylethylamines I have known and loved, and T-Cal is tryptamines I have known and loved. And so he created like all of the 2Cs and, you know, like all like just entire categories of drugs, but like hundreds and hundreds of different compounds that he, you know, created. And he, in all of these books, like he published the formulas for how to synthesize them. That's what those books are. And so like, he actually had a DEA license at the time. And then, you know, back in the 90s, the DEA ended up having to like withdraw his license because they were, you know, every like drug laboratory that was getting busted, that his books were like, you know, the manual
right there. You know. Yeah, exactly.
But Sasha Shulgin, you know, I mean, this guy, you know, like he was, you know, a member of the Bohemian Club. He went to Bohemian Grove every year for like 50 years. You know, two of the 4 surviving members of the Grateful Dead are members of the Bohemian Club since like 2000. Bob Weir and Mickey Hart are both Bohemian Grovers. Yeah, I mean they go every year, and Mickey Hart. Yeah, no, but I mean, you know, like this is like, you know, this is not Mickey Mouse. Like these are like, you know, high level, you know, occultists. Mickey Hart, the drummer for the Grateful Dead, one of 2 drummers actually. He is like part of the hillbilly camp, which is like, you know, the Bohemian Grove has like dozens of different encampments. So like you're assigned to like, you know, whatever, you know, camp. And that's, you know, who you mostly like hang out with, eat your meals with, and, you know, sleep at that campsite. Mickey Hart is like part of the hillbilly camp, which is where like George Bush and like their whole family camps at the hillbilly. Like it's like among the highest level, because there's like a hierarchy of the camps at the Bohemian Grove, and like Mickey Hart is ultra elite. It's mind-blowing. That's true. And the reason that like we know that is because like, you know, the Bohemian Grove, like there are like hundreds and hundreds of people that like work as like servants, waiters, maids, you know, like whatever, that live in Sonoma County. I mean, people know. I personally know people that like one of my friends like like works on refrigeration and does like the coolers at the, you know, for like the kitchens at Bohemian Grove.
What?
Yeah. And so he's been there and like seen these guys. I mean, it's just nuts. So, you know, like that's how we know. Anyways, it's so hard to stay on track.
Ask you about that later.
Oh yeah, no, it's just hilarious, you know. And this is just like, you know, a friend, and he's like, oh yeah, I'm here, you know, like this is crazy. But Owsley Stanley like winds up in Sasha Shulgin's classroom, and Shulgin like takes him under his wing. Shulgin, like his origin is he was working for Dow Chemical, which is, you know, like one of the big chemical manufacturers in this country, who was also heavily involved with Operation Paperclip, specifically with Otto Ambros, who was like the chief like scientist at IG Farben. And IG Farben was the chemical cartel run by the Nazi Party, right? Yes. I mean, they were like the main industrial like factor of the Nazi Party. And Otto Ambros was the one who invented like sarin gas and tabin gas, you know, these like nerve agents, you know, that they used to kill a lot of people. They were very, very effective, you know, but they were developed as insecticides. That's what IG Farben was working on to protect, like, you know, German, you know, domestic crops, you know, during wartime. And he came up with these pesticides that were active at such low levels, kind of like LSD in a way, but active at such low levels that if you like unleashed larger amounts, they would easily kill people. So, that's his background. He comes on the scene and is consulting for Dow Chemical after he got, released from like a very abbreviated jail sentence after the Nuremberg trials. He's brought over to like consult for all these chemical companies in the United States, including DuPont, including Dow Chemical. And Sasha Shulgin just happens to be working at Dow Chemical, and in 1955 invents this insecticide. Like, maybe just maybe Otto Ambrose was, mentoring him. I think it stands to reason. But he invented this insecticide called Zactrin, and it was a wildly successful product because it was like a biodegradable insecticide. And after that became like such a big product, the people at Dow Chemical were like, all right, Sasha Shulgin, what do you want to work on? We're going to give you like carte blanche to do whatever you want. And he was like, oh, I've heard about these like psychedelic drugs. I think I want to start making some. So he started working on this one called STP, which is a phenylethylamine. So it's like an amphetamine based like psychedelic, kind of like, not exactly like, MDMA, but, like in those kind of like, category of drugs, related to amphetamines. And also Sasha Shulgin was the guy who like popularized MDMA. It had not existed. It was invented by Merck, another German drug manufacturer, in like the 30s or something like that. And they weren't part of the IG Farben cartel, but definitely involved with the Nazi party, blah, blah. But he discovered the Merck formula and synthesized MDMA in like the 70s. And that's like why MDMA became like a popular drug, is because of Sasha Shulgin, like entirely. He's the reason that anybody's ever heard of it. So, that's who this guy is. And Owsley like makes contact with Sasha Shulgin, and Shulgin is like, oh, hey, like here's all like the formulas you need to start making LSD. And, at the time LSD was legal. So Owsley Stanley like set up a lab in Berkeley and started manufacturing LSD with a woman that he was introduced to by Sasha Shulgin, whose name is Melissa Cargill. Melissa Cargill is like the heiress, like the, scion of the Cargill Corporation, which is the largest privately owned company in America. It's worth billions and billions. It's entirely owned by the Cargill family. And she is like one of their, like heiresses. And she was Owsley Stanley. Yeah, she was Owsley Stanley's like acid cooking partner. And so they said, no, I mean, like all of these people are ultra elites. Like these are not regular people. And so they were cooking the acid and got hooked up with the Merry Pranksters and the Grateful Dead, through the acid tests. And the first acid test that Owsley went to was at Muir Beach, which is in Marin County, which is, where the Grateful Dead like ended up moving to after the Haight-Ashbury. They all relocated to different parts of Marin County. What's really interesting about Marin County is that's where Sir Francis Drake like landed when he discovered California back in like the 1500s. Francis Drake came from the town of Tavistock in Devon, England. No, I mean, you can't make this up, So Marin County was like, so Marin County was where, like at Point Reyes, on the Point Reyes Peninsula is where Sir Francis Drake landed and like discovered, he called it like Northern California, he called it New Albion, like it's like New England, Albion being like the Latin name for England. So, So that's where Owsley, comes into the scene in Marin County at Muir Beach, where I actually used to live. It's an amazing place. But they had like an acid test at this bar that used to be right there on the beach, a crazy thing. And he was making acid. Up until that point, they were getting the acid for the acid test from Kesey, from the Menlo Park VA hospital that was from the CIA, that was getting it from Sandoz, from Albert Hoffman's laboratory in Basel, Switzerland. What's interesting about that, is that Sandoz was aligned with, up until 1929, they were basically like part of IG Farben. And so right before, Hitler, came to power in Germany, like IG Farben and Sandoz, were like the same company. Basically, Sandoz was just kind of like a Swiss aspect of it. In the, fallout of that, there became like a Swiss chemical cartel that included Ciba-Geigy, which is, they invented like Ritalin and all these like other drugs, Sandoz, and there's like one other one, but they were all doing like weird drug stuff. Sandoz, is where Albert Hoffman, discovered LSD under the mentorship of Arthur Stoll. And Arthur Stoll, was doing all this research on ergot fungus, which is, is the basis of LSD. It's a parasitic fungus that contaminates like rye and wheat, and like has been known, since like time immemorial, to like cause, like hallucinatory states, and, was used like in ancient Greece and the Eleusinian mysteries, like they were using ergot fungus, as, the initiation in the mysteries. And, what's really interesting is, of course, like, it's all really funny. Albert Hoffman synthesized, so his mentor was Arthur Stoll. Arthur Stoll was a fellow of the Royal Society. And, if the Royal Society is like the scientific establishment. I mean, they are like, when they talk about the science, like that's the Royal Society. And they've existed since like the 1600s. They spawned out of Rosicrucianism. Initially it was called like the Invisible College. And, that was kind of like a code term also for the Rosicrucians. And, so the Royal Society, is like, like this, kind of like very much, occulted, esoteric, organization, but that, dictates like what is academic mainstream scientific pursuits, and the gatekeepers of like all scientific knowledge. In, the 1600s, Isaac Newton was the president of the Royal Society for like 24 years. I mean, this is like big time. So Arthur Stoll is a fellow of the Royal Society. He's the one who told Albert Hoffman, you need to start investigating ergot fungus. And, they were using it as like a vasoconstrictor. And he just happened to synthesize LSD 25 in 1938, had no idea what it was, allegedly. And then in April of 1943, he like took it off the shelf and accidentally like got some on him and, felt some of the effects, right? And then April 19th of 1943, he intentionally dosed himself with 250 micrograms. That was Bicycle Day. That's what, how the world has come to know LSD. So what's crazy about all of that is that, like, in 1933, a guy named Leo Perutz wrote this book called St. Peter's Snow. And the book is about a baron, like a noble in a provincial area of Germany, who was hiring chemists in Berlin, from Berlin, to like come to his like, estate to like make drugs based on ergot fungus. I mean, this this predates the discovery synthesis of LSD 25 by 5 years, and the like actual discovery of its like effects by 10 years. But this book was about that, and how they were using, how the baron, the German baron, wanted, he hired this woman, the chemist, to develop this stuff so that he could use it to like mind control his, like, the subjects that lived in his estate. No joke. Well, what's really crazy, the guy who wrote that book, Leo Perutz, his first cousin was a fellow named Max Perutz, who was like a Nobel Prize winner, a fellow of the Royal Society. He like invented crystallography, and his PhD student was Francis Crick, who discovered the double helix of DNA under the influence of LSD. So it's all, these people are all, in just completely intertwined on that side too. So you have like the intelligence circles, but you have like the scientific, chemistry, academic circles too. They're just like completely all intertwined and all, involved in like occultism and, Freemasonry, like Rosicrucianism, all of these things. And that's where all this comes from. Trying to get back to Owsley Stanley because he's important. He ends up like making all of the acid that like turned on, the whole like hippie culture. I mean,
wow,
they were like Owsley, like the Owsley acid is like the most legendary acid. I mean, we're talking about like, that's how Jimi Hendrix got turned on to acid. The Beatles got turned on to acid. Like everybody, like all the acid at Monterey Pop, at Woodstock, it was all made by Owsley Stanley. He's a really, really important figure. But, again, like, this was not like some just out of nowhere person. He was a blue blood elite. He was groomed by Sasha Shulgin, who came from Dow Chemical, who was groomed by Otto Ambrose. Dow Chemical, by the way, is owned by the Dow family, who funds something called the Interlochen Academy. If you've heard of that, it's like a music camp, like summer camp for like really gifted musical children, that was attended by Jeffrey Epstein and then was like endowed by Jeffrey Epstein.
Oh, come on.
Oh yeah. No joke. Jeffrey Epstein, and this is, I mean, it's really disturbing to think this. Jeffrey Epstein had his own cabin at the Interlochen Academy. It's like up on the shores of Lake Michigan, in northern Michigan, and yes, and it was started by the Dow Chemical family, who brought in all the paperclip Nazis who were getting the money from Jeffrey Epstein, who let Jeffrey Epstein like just have his own little like private cabin in the middle of these kids at summer camp. I can't even explain. Like all of these people are so intertwined. It's just nuts. And so, anyways, Owsley, at a certain point, he does get arrested after LSD becomes scheduled. His like apprentice was a guy named Tim Scully, and he connected with a guy from New York, like kind of an underground chemist from New York named Nick Sand, and they became like the chemists. They were the ones who started making the orange sunshine acid. And around the same time, this was like they became the producers for this network. There was like the hippie mafia called the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. And so this is really important. And the Brotherhood of Eternal Love started in around like 1965-ish in the Los Angeles area by a fellow named John Griggs, who is like a motorcycle gang guy. And also a lot of this stuff like does involve motorcycle gangs. Like the Hells Angels were a really big part of, these networks in terms of distributing, the acid, in terms of distributing like the speed and the weed and all this stuff. So, but John Griggs was part of a motorcycle gang in the Los Angeles area. And him and his, gang members, robbed a Hollywood, like straight up, like home invasion style. These were bad dudes. Robbed at gunpoint this Hollywood producer who had like a big stash of LSD. This was when it was still legal, and it was just, like people were taking it, clinically, under the supervision of like psychotherapists and stuff. But it was, it was like getting out in Hollywood, like Cary Grant was into it, like different people. So it was, kind of becoming trendy, and they got this like big vial of acid from this robbery that they committed at this, Hollywood producer's house. They all took like allegedly what amounted to 1,000 micrograms each, which is like 10 times like a normal dose basically. And had this like crazy epiphany, and they all like threw their guns into the ocean and were like, we're not doing this biker gang anymore. Now we're just like gonna be like hippie gang and do like sell drugs. So the story goes. But yeah, this is the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, and this is like circling back to like Timothy Leary, William Mellon Hitchcock, and that whole East Coast scene. They were like coming out to the West Coast and got connected with these guys in the Brotherhood. William Mellon Hitchcock, like he started putting up his money, but like CIA, money. He was laundering money for the CIA through like the Castle Bank, which was Paul Hellowell's operation in the Bahamas. He is tied in with like Resorts International, which like ended up being a company that Donald Trump owned at one point, like crazy stuff. But William Mellon Hitchcock starts financing this like hippie mafia to manufacture the orange sunshine acid. And they also were like sending people over to Afghanistan to bring in all like the high grade weed and hash from Afghanistan. And like these are most likely their sources were like the Mujahideen, and like who now are the Taliban, who were like radicalized by the CIA and funded by the CIA. So yeah, this is where, and all of like the modern cannabis genetics that like didn't come from South America, because like all of like cannabis basically at that point in time came from South America and Mexico. But these guys like went over to Afghanistan and started getting like the Kushes and the Afghanis and all this stuff, and brought those genetic lines into the country. And so like all the like modern cannabis genetics are like really predicated off of those Afghani lines. And it was all from the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. And they were trafficking in like just hundreds of thousands of like pounds of this like high grade Afghani hash. And this was like their operation. They had a little bookstore, like an occult bookstore in Laguna Beach, California, which is a little beach town just south of Los Angeles, like in between San Diego and Los Angeles. And that's where they operated out of. And they ended up buying a 3 ranch in Idlewild, California, which is up in the San Bernardino Mountains. And like there's all kinds of really spooky stuff in San Bernardino area. Like Ridgecrest is like the largest naval ammunition, artillery storage facility in the world. I mean, there's all kinds of really weird spooky stuff going on in that area. Anyways, that's where they bought this big ranch. Timothy Leary came, and like after he got kicked out of Millbrook in New York, he like came and lived there. That's where he was living when he was running for governor of California. I mean, he had like a big campaign going. He ended up getting arrested, while he was living at the ranch for like a weed charge, and ended up going to prison. The Brotherhood, I mean, it's crazy stuff, but the Brotherhood of Eternal Love ended up commissioning the Weather Underground, who, you probably know was like kind of a political activist, like terrorist organization. Yeah. They were bombings on campuses and, government buildings and stuff like this. The Brotherhood of Eternal Love paid the Weather Underground $25,000. It was Bernadine Dorn and I can't. Sorry, I'm having a brain fart on the people's names who Bill Weather. Bill. Anyways, doesn't matter. They were running a bill. Anyways, sorry. But they paid them $25,000 cash to go and break Timothy Leary out of prison in California. And somehow he just was able to just walk out. They got him to Algeria, and he was being like safe housed in Algeria by Huey Newton and the Black Panthers. So all of these like organizations.
What the hell?
Yes. Timothy Leary was yeah. So it's the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, the Weather Underground, the Black Panthers. They're all like, it's one big network. And obviously like it was all infiltrated or being like co-opted by the CIA, by the FBI. You had this was COINTELPRO was going on at the time. So like so many of these people like were feds who were running these ops. And that's kind of like the really crazy part. So the Brotherhood, they're like, all right, this is going big. And they are like, the Orange Sunshine operation was like getting way bigger than what Owsley had been doing. And they wanted to like really ramp it up. And William Mellon Hitchcock brought them all this money to be able to finance it. This guy shows up out of nowhere from Europe. His name is Ronald Hadley Stark. And this is where it gets just bonkers crazy. And so this guy, like nobody really knows anything about who he is. Allegedly, like, he was, a guy from Brooklyn, New York. His real name was Ronald Shitsky. Like, he was like kind of older.
Ronald Shitsky.
Yeah, but he was like this insanely like high IQ guy that spoke like, 7-8 different languages fluently. He like, traveled all over Europe, was in all these like crazy circles. And, he ended up like getting into, basically like, he was working for the CIA all along. But he started like manufacturing LSD in France in a perfume factory. And he comes over to California and links up with the Brotherhood of Eternal Love through this guy. I believe his name is Sullivan, was the connection, a guy in England who, anyways, doesn't really matter. Ronald Stark hooks up with the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, and he starts bankrolling them and like churning out like just insane amounts of acid, like, like way more than Owsley ever made, way more than Sandoz ever made. Like, this was when it really became mainstream and like it was everywhere. And, in and around 1976, he ends up getting like arrested in Italy on drug charges. He was like in a hotel room with like thousands of pounds of like weed and, whatever else in Italy, and goes to prison. But like, basically, he was, it certainly appears that he was like placed in that situation by the CIA, like, Operation Gladio, basically the, kind of like the stay behind networks after, like World War II, like to, keep certain like, political elements like the socialists and the communists from like taking control and to infiltrate them, like Operation Gladio's, like it's a pretty like broad spectrum thing, but it was, the confluence of like the Vatican, the CIA, the mafia, the Sicilian mafia, like crazy stuff. They were operating like all over Europe and like into Turkey, but like it was really like Italy was the center of the operations. And so basically like, it stands to reason that this Ronald Stark guy was like a Gladio operative. He went to prison basically so that he could, make contact with the Red Brigade, these like Italian communists. And he was like teaching them how to make bombs and like, grooming them as like, soldiers in prison. No joke. This was like the Acid King, was in an Italian prison. And he turned down like the opportunity to be paroled. He wanted to stay in prison until 1979, and this judge brought him up and was like, okay, we're going to release you because we have all this document that you work for the CIA. We have pay stubs from the CIA going back to 1960.
Oh my God.
This is in 1979. So at this point, Ronald Stark had been like on the CIA payroll demonstrably for like 20 years. And that's how he got released. I mean, this is like on the record. That's how he got released from Italian prison. In, I think, 1982, he ended up like getting busted in Amsterdam doing some like drug trafficking. He was like extradited to the United States and died of a heart attack in custody. It was like, right. But this is the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. Like they were really being like, the operation, like the manufacturing of the LSD was being overseen by a CIA like operative, Ronald Stark. It was being funded and the money was being laundered by a CIA operative, William Mellon Hitchcock. Like, I mean, it was like both sides. And like, that's the hippie mafia. And these guys were like the OG, like Grateful Dead tour scene. Like they were like the pleasure crew is what they called themselves. And they were like the first people that was like traveling extensively with the Grateful Dead, like going from like show to show. And it was the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. And it wasn't just because they were like into the music and part of the scene, but like what was the Grateful Dead, when it became this giant like touring machine, it was a distribution network. People would come to the concerts and like, the parking lots at these concerts were like open air, like markets. And this is where like all the drugs were being like distributed throughout the country. So like, all the weed, all the acid, all the stuff, like all the high grade stuff, if the Grateful Dead came to your town, like the Brotherhood, people were out like pushing it in the parking lots. And then a town, a state, a whole region of the country would be flooded with these drugs, like in the aftermath of the concert. In the course of like a whole, tour, like the whole country would be flooded with these things, and it was like certain batches, it was all the same. And, in the concerts, it was just like a bigger version of these acid tests from, the 60s. You're talking about like tens of thousands of people who all got the same molecule out in the parking lot, all took it at the same time, all are being influenced by the same, like, input, sonic and visual inputs. Like it's a crazy study group. If you want to like study, like a mass, psychological response to chemicals and, like music and visual stimulation, like that's it, like it's just unbelievable. So, these were like, open air, MK Ultra experiments, on like mass scales. And, by the early 90s, before Jerry Garcia died, I mean, they like, they were playing stadium shows with like 80,000 people inside and like 100,000 people that were just on tour with the band that were outside, that didn't even like go into. There were more people outside the concerts than inside the concerts. It was like a traveling city, and this is like, it was really serious and this was before the internet. This was before like the dark web and the Silk Road. Like this was how drugs like got distributed, around the country, big time. And it's still like to a large degree, like, the people, the like the sons and the grandsons of, these people from that time, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, like they're all like the big, like, cannabis like breeders and growers, like in California, here in Oregon, like it's multi-generational. It all came from the Brotherhood, and so all like spawned out of this network, and it's big, it's like it's really big today, and now it's becoming like and it like a total industry, of course. And, with the psychedelics becoming like, pushed for legalization. And there's so much that we could talk about there, but like, you probably know who like Peter Thiel is,
sure.
who, runs Palantir. Well, Peter Thiel is like the big money man behind like the big psychedelic, like industrial psychedelic corporations. So Atai Life Sciences, Compass Pathways, their like biggest funder is Peter Thiel. And this is really scary, like, because this is the guy who, is like Mr. Surveillance State. He started Palantir with funding from InQtel, which is the CIA's, like investment fund, like hedge fund. And he's turning around and it's just like comes full circle, like now it's he's the CIA, but like now it's a private industry. He's putting the money in, and and it's bigger than it ever was. And there's all these university studies that are like being pushed to legitimize psychedelics, and it's just it's just crazy how intertwined it is with Silicon Valley, with like high tech industries. All the people in Silicon Valley are like using psychedelics. It's it's just like it's the thing, right? I mean, so I don't know, man. I kind of feel like I've gone in so many millions of directions, and I didn't touch on but like a fraction of this stuff. So maybe if you have any questions, or you like want to talk about like any aspects of this, like, well, you can kind of like redirect maybe, or I don't know how much time we have.
Well, this was a great chat. I think if we want to get deeper into some different areas, I think that'd be best, maybe to leave that for another episode. But before we close out tonight, I know another topic that kind of gets thrown in with these is Laurel Canyon. Do you have much knowledge on Laurel Canyon? Maybe get into that a little bit before we wrap up.
Yeah. Have you read the Dave McGowan book?
I have the Dave McGowan book. Yeah, I read it a while back. Yeah, a few years ago now. But
so yeah, I mean, Laurel Canyon was like kind of operating like parallel to like San Francisco. It was kind of like more involved with maybe like the more mainstream kind of like music, like the Byrds, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, like some real big acts, and definitely like all of those people also, their families were military, and the Doors, like, all of them, like Joni Mitchell, their families were all like either, military intelligence, high level, like, military, officers, or like robber baron industrialists, mega wealthy, generationally wealthy families. What they had going on there, and in Laurel Canyon, what kind of like, a parallel thing. They did do aspects in LA that were hosted by Ken Kesey and the Grateful Dead, but like they had, kind of their own thing, and it was really intertwined with Hollywood. It was, really intertwined with this Lookout Mountain Air Force Base installation where they were filming a lot of like, propaganda for, the Army, for NASA, the Air Force. And the speculation is that that's where Kubrick like filmed the moon landing footage.
Oh, okay, okay.
Right at Lookout Mountain. I mean, it's this gigantic, like it was the most state-of-the-art movie studio in the world at the time, right at the top of Laurel Canyon. And it's actually owned today by the actor Jared Leto. No joke.
That's right. Yeah, I forgot about that.
And he's like a hardcore occultist. I just saw that he's like the star of like the new remake of Tron, which is interesting because it's like all about video games and like going inside of the video games and kind of transhumanism aspects. But he had anyways, it's crazy. So like the Laurel Canyon scene, it was also Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa's father was, working at like Edgewood Arsenal. Right. But like specifically where they were weaponizing, chemical agents, including LSD in the DC area. Like, I mean, just, it just like, it's infinitely like interconnected. But obviously like the Laurel Canyon scene, this was like, Charles Manson and the family were really integrated in with all of that. And they were hanging out, with those musicians and, like living at Dennis Wilson's house, Dennis Wilson from the Beach Boys. And, like Benedict Canyon is like the next canyon over from Laurel Canyon. And that's where Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate lived. And all of those people were cross-pollinated, with the Laurel Canyon people too. And that, Topanga Canyon, all of those, canyons above, LA, it was Hollywood, music industry, they were all doing like these crazy occult rituals with Charles Manson and the Process Church of the Final Judgment and the Church of Scientology and, kind of all the same thing. So I don't know if you had anything, to add about that. But yeah, Laurel Canyon was like really, like I said, really very much like a parallel, although in a lot of ways, like maybe more influential in like, at least like the mainstream culture. I'd say like, the Laurel Canyon scene, produced like these bigger acts that were like playing on the radio and stuff like that, whereas like in San Francisco, with like the Grateful Dead, it was more about like the boots on the ground, like, play a concert and like do the ritual, initiation, draw the people in. But like the Laurel Canyon, was like play the tunes on the radio, make it like, pop friendly, make it like look good for TV, stuff like that. So like, I think that was, that aspect of the operation. The San Francisco is kind of like, the other aspect of this, I mean, two like arms of the same operation.
Right. No, absolutely. No, that makes great sense. Was there, I mean, can you think of any other bands that were like the Grateful Dead where they had that, traveling circus like that? I can't really think of.
Well, I mean, just it's like since the Grateful Dead, since Jerry Garcia died, like the band Fish that goes back to like the 80s, but got really popular in the 90s, PHISH. They've had like a big touring culture and, like really involved with like the same elements, to kind of carry that on after the Grateful Dead, but like not concurrent with the Grateful Dead. Like it was singular. It was like totally like a monolith. Like there's nothing like that. And, for 30 years while Jerry Garcia was alive, from 1965 to 1995, but like it's been, it's been 30 years. It's been 30 years now since Jerry Garcia died, and they've like continued going on, and they're like, in certain ways, because of the internet and social media, like more popular than ever.
Yeah.
And now they're playing like these residencies with, like, they're, you know, like the lead guitar player for the band is John Mayer. I don't know if you know that. Like, it's crazy. Yeah, John Mayer.
I didn't know that. Oh.
Yeah. He's like the Jerry Garcia of, like, you know, for millennials and Gen Z, is like John Mayer. Nope, like, it's crazy. But they play these like residencies, you know, at the Sphere in Las Vegas, which is like this crazy transhumanist, like, you know, multimedia, you know, sensory, you know, do you know what the Sphere is?
Yeah, for sure.
But anyways, man, I mean, like, it's still going on. And I think that really, like, more so than anything, like, what really has, like, taken up the mantle from, you know, like these, you know, that whole scene is like the electronic music. Because in a lot of ways, like, the Grateful Dead were like the start of electronic music in a lot of ways. Like, they were using, you know, these different types of like sonic inputs and equipment. You know, Owsley Stanley, which we never even got to, was their sound engineer and created the wall of sound, and, you know, like, developed all of, you know, like, all of these like new types of equipment that had never been used before to like reproduce sound. You know, and so it really like influenced electronic music to an incredible degree. And obviously, like, the drug culture part, but, like, you know, the rave culture is really, you know, kind of like an outgrowth of that, you know, Grateful Dead scene. And also, like, very much, you know, with like MDMA, you know, being, you know, coming from Sasha Shulgin, but like, you know, being, you know, the MDMA and like the rave scene really started in Dallas in the 1980s. And it was being like pushed, you know, from like actually the Israeli mafia, through this guy, Richard Doblin, who is like the head of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which is like the main like nonprofit organization in charge of, like, you know, getting like psychedelic, you know, like studies done for legalization and stuff. So you have, like, on the nonprofit side, you have Rick Doblin. On the for-profit side, you have Peter Thiel. But yeah, he's the one who was like working. He was like a front man via like CIA and Mossad for the Israeli mafia, like trafficking the MDMA into Dallas to, like, you know, create, you know, the rave culture that was like parallel, you know, to like what was going on, you know, with the acid and the Grateful Dead at the time. And now, like, you probably saw there was a gigantic rave at the pyramids in Giza the other day.
Yes.
With right. And it was like, you know, just over the top, like Freemasonic, like, you know, just crazy, you know, occult stuff, you know, symbols. And but again, like, the Grateful Dead was the first band to perform at the pyramids in 1978. That was their like whole thing. And they did it.
Wow.
Like in confluence with a lunar eclipse. And it was like 47 years ago. Yeah, it was 47 years ago, like in September this year. And like 47 is a big number because like 4 and 7 make 11. That was like Aleister Crowley's number. It means like, you know, abracadabra. It was like his magical number. 47, Donald Trump. Like, I don't know. There's some weird stuff, but yeah, the Grateful Dead did like the first, like, you know, events, like, you know, pop music things at the pyramids, like in 1978, and that's where all that started. So like the reason that you see this this crazy like rave thing that went viral 2 days ago is because they did it 47 years ago. So, you know, all of this culture comes from them and comes from that. So
that's cool, man. Well, that's a great way to end it off. One quick question though: how did Jerry Garcia lose his finger?
So he was 6 years old, and his family was camping on the Russian River in Sonoma County, and him and his brother were chopping firewood for the campfire, and his brother like took a hatchet and that's why they call it his miracle finger, because it was his middle finger on his right hand. Somehow he cut it at the first knuckle, like without damaging any of the rest of his fingers that he would have been playing guitar.
How does that happen?
Well, so that's the story. It may be that like it was part of some other kind of occult initiation, because like I don't know how it could have happened as an accident, but that's the story, that his brother cut it off when he was 6 years old.
Okay. Interesting. All right. Well, thanks so much for your time, man. We're definitely gonna have to bring you back sometime, because I love the research you do, and yeah, you bring a lot of great knowledge to the show. So I do appreciate it. Can you just let people know where they can find you? I know that you have an X account that you post a lot of great stuff to, but I don't know if there's anywhere else you want to lead people to.
This is the first time that I've ever like been on a podcast or like shown my face or anything like that. So I hope it wasn't like too disjointed or weird or rambling. I know
we had a great chat, man. This was great. You did a wonderful job.
There are just so many different like topics, but so I really appreciate you like giving me the opportunity. And I have an account on Twitter. It's at accountable to me. The name on the account is Habsburg Jawlly West, and anybody that may want to check it out, that's where I post stuff. So
right on. Yeah, I recommend you guys check it out. He posts a lot of great stuff. Thanks to everyone in the chat. Thanks to everyone listening and watching. Also, make sure to please subscribe to the Divulgence podcast on YouTube. You can check me out on X, and you can also listen to audio episodes on Spotify and wherever you get your podcasts. So yeah, take care, and everyone stay safe.